Today we're diving into one of the most incredible stories from the Second Punic War. It's a legendary showdown between the full might of the Roman Republic and the single fortified city of Syracuse. Now this is a tale of empires clashing, for sure, but really, at its heart, it's the story of one brilliant mind versus the greatest army the world had ever seen.
So that's the big question, right? How on earth did a 78-year-old inventor manage to hold off the Roman war machine? Well, the answer has nothing to do with troop numbers or military tactics as you know them. It all comes down to the genius of one man, who became his city's secret weapon, a man who literally changed the face of warfare with inventions that seemed to border on magic.
And here he is, the man, the legend, Archimedes. He was already famous as a mathematician and inventor, but now he had a new job, defending his home from the Romans. And this painting just captures it perfectly, doesn't it? One man's intellect, his brain, orchestrating the entire defense of a city. But to really get how we got to this point, we need to ask, why were the Romans at their gates in the first place?
See, before all this, Syracuse was actually a good friend to Rome. So we've got to look at the politics, at what happened that turned this loyal ally into a bitter enemy.
For decades, things were great. Syracuse and Rome were close. But in 215 BC, King Hero II died, and everything changed. His grandson, who was young and easily influenced, took the throne, and he decided to flip his allegiance over to Rome's mortal enemy, Carthage. Rome tried diplomacy, but the new alliance was a threat they just couldn't ignore. And just like that, the stage was set for one of the most famous sieges in all of history.
So the Romans show up, right? They're probably expecting a pretty standard siege. What they got instead was a full-blown revolution in warfare, all because Archimedes' mind completely changed the game.
The Romans brought their absolute best stuff. A massive floating siege tower called the Sambuca, ships with scaling ladders, the whole shebang. But they were met with something totally unexpected. On the other side wasn't just a fortified wall. It was a single, brilliant mind.
One of his most terrifying inventions was what we call the claw of Archimedes. Just try to imagine you're a Roman sailor. You see this gigantic crane-like hook come down from the city walls, grab the front of your ship, lift it completely out of the water, and then just let go, smashing it to pieces. It was as much psychological warfare as it was engineering genius. Absolutely terrifying.
And then, of course, there's the legend of the heat ray. Now, the story goes that Archimedes built a giant mirror, or maybe a bunch of them, to focus the sun's rays onto the Roman ships and set their sails on fire from a distance. Now, whether this is actually possible is still debated by historians, but the legend itself just goes to show you the kind of awe and sheer terror his inventions inspired.
So, the impact of all these incredible defenses? It was immediate, and it was devastating for the Romans. Archimedes' ingenuity brought the most powerful army in the world to a complete and total standstill.
For months, the Romans were just stuck. They were totally frustrated. Every time they tried a direct assault, they were beaten back with huge losses. They couldn't get through the walls, but they also couldn't set up a perfect blockade, so the city could still get supplies. The siege just bogged down into this long, ugly, and costly war of attrition.
So you might be wondering, well, where were Syracuse's allies, the Carthaginians, in all this? They did try to help. They sent forces to try and break the siege, but the Romans drove them back. See, Carthage was already fighting its own war against Rome over in Spain, so they just couldn't spare the troops. They managed to sneak some supplies in, which helped drag things out, but for the most part, Syracuse was on its own.
In the end, it wasn't brute force that broke this unbreakable stalemate. It was a single moment of weakness, a bit of overconfidence, exploited by pure Roman cunning.
You know, success can make you sloppy. And the people of Syracuse, after beating back the mighty Romans again and again, they got cocky. They started to believe their walls and Archimedes' incredible machines were just unbeatable. And that belief, that created the one fatal opening the Romans needed.
So, the Romans got a piece of intel. The entire city was about to celebrate the annual festival for the goddess Artemis. And you know what that means? Lots of celebrating, maybe a little too much wine. So under the cover of night, while the city partied and the guards were distracted, a small group of Roman soldiers quietly scaled a section of the wall. Once they were inside, they opened the gates for the rest of the army, and just like that, the outer city had fallen.
But it still wasn't over. The defenders retreated to the inner citadel, a fortress within the city. And for another 8 long months they held out. The final blow didn't come from an assault, but from a traitor. An Iberian captain, one of the defenders' own commanders, cut a deal to save his own skin and opened a gate for the Romans.
And now, amidst all the chaos and the fighting, as the city finally falls, we get to the really tragic end of this story. The death of the very genius who had single-handedly defended it for so long.
The Roman general Marcellus was a soldier through and through, but he had a deep respect for his enemy's brilliance. He knew Archimedes was a once-in-a-generation mind, and he gave specific, explicit orders. The inventor's life was to be spared.
But in the chaos of a city being sacked, orders get lost. As Roman soldiers were rampaging through the streets, one of them bursts into Archimedes' home. And he finds this old man completely lost in thought, studying a mathematical diagram he'd drawn in the sand. When the soldier interrupted him, Archimedes basically told him to get lost and not disturb his circles. The soldier, having no idea who this old man was, killed him right there on the spot.
He was 78 years old. A whole lifetime of genius just snuffed out in a single moment of brutal, ignorant violence.
So, the city falls, and its great defender is gone. Let's take a look at the strategic consequences. Why was this victory so incredibly important for Rome?
The fall of Syracuse was a massive turning point in the war. Rome now controlled all of Sicily, which eliminated a huge Carthaginian threat and gave them a vital source of grain. It meant they could now focus their armies elsewhere, and Sicily itself became a critical staging ground for future campaigns, including the very one that would eventually bring Carthage to its knees.
But that victory came at a brutal cost. The Roman soldiers, angry and frustrated by how long and how difficult the siege had been, showed very little mercy. The city was completely looted, and many of its people were either killed or sold into slavery. A very dark end to a story of such incredible resistance. And that really brings us to our final thought. Rome won the battle, right? They took the city, they secured the island. On that day, power won. But here we are more than 2,000 years later, and the story we remember isn't just about a Roman victory. It's the story of Archimedes. His name, his genius, that's what has endured. Which leaves us with a question. When genius clashes with power, who really wins in the end?